My topic for our reflections this morning and then going in a little bit to the afternoon is, as I've expressed it, a God of mercy, a people of mercy, so the year of mercy and the mission of the church. What we'll be talking about, and I'll say this in many different ways, is that because God is a God of mercy, and because in baptism as Christians, we have been literally plunged into God's life, it is our task, it is our mission to be involved in God's mission. And that mission, from the angle today that we're going to look at, is the mission of mercy. So I want to be. Let me also say this. We're going to. Well, I'll say it in a couple of minutes as we get to it. But I want to begin with a poem, maybe a little heavy in some ways. It's from Shakespeare. And I'm sure many of you know it. I ran across this poem for the first time when I was in 9th grade, when we were studying Shakespeare's play, The Merchant of Venice. It is a poem that comes toward the end of the play, and where one of the main characters, I won't go into the whole complicated plot, but one of the main characters has this famous speech about mercy. And I think it says an awful lot about mercy, and so we'll begin with that. This is the scene toward the end of the play. I think this is Sir John Gielgud, and I'm not sure who is playing Portia there. But in any case, this is the poem, and will kind of set us for our reflections this morning. The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesses him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mighty. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. His scepter shows the force of temporal power, the attribute to awe and majesty, wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above this sceptered sway. It is enthroned in the heart of kings. It is an attribute to God himself. And earthly power doth then show likest God when mercy seasons justice. Therefore, consider this, that in the course of justice, none of us should see salvation. We do pray for mercy, and that same prayer should teach us all to render the deeds of mercy. Amazing, incredible poem. As I've read it over and over again and preparing for my presentations on mercy, I've just every time I read it, I get deeper into it. And this famous speech, which I don't know, you probably heard it already quoted in talks that you've heard in the Year of Mercy. Certainly quoted a lot, I'm sure, in this year. But it startled me when I reread it, 8-9 months ago as I was preparing this presentation, because I actually found in that poem the outline for what I want to share about mission and mercy today. As Shakespeare said, mercy is an attribute to God as such. And people are most like God when they season justice with mercy and render the deeds of mercy. And that really points to the fact of my reflections having two parts. The first part is that we're going to reflect on the triune God, God as a communion in mission, as a God of mercy. Now, how we're going to work this out in our seminar today is that I'm going to give this first part in the first presentation. It probably goes, all depends on how wordy I get and stuff, but it goes usually about 45 minutes. And then I want us to just take a few moments to sit in silence and to ponder what I'm saying. This first part is a kind of a biblical meditation on mercy. And so after, a few moments of silence, I'd like to ask you to destroy this wonderful setup and turn to one another and talk a bit about the presentation. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to say, are there any other passages in Scripture? Are there any other themes in Scripture that you'd like to share with the group? I can only present a few, but there's so many more. And so, to all of us get involved in kind of reflecting on that and sharing that. So we'll do that then. We'll talk for, 15, 20 minutes, however long we need to, and then we'll open it up for some sharing. Then we'll have morning tea. And then we'll come back and we'll do the second part. And the second part is a bit shorter, but I'm going to reflect on how how we as church are called to be people of mercy, or to kind of paraphrase some of Pope Francis's ideas, that we are called to be a community of missionary, mercy-bearing disciples. And we'll do the same thing. Have a pause, have some sharing in small groups, and then sharing in large groups. So that's how we'll, so you don't have to listen to me all morning, and we can all get involved in reflecting on this understanding, this real grace, I think, for this year, to have us reflect on and practice mercy. So let's begin with our first section, talking about the God of mercy, a communion in mission. I'd like to think of our God, our triune God, as God is not just a communion. God is a communion in mission. That what it means to be Trinity is not just to be a community in God's self, but to be out through creation, bringing creation back to God's self. So that idea of God going out, bringing things back, and coming back to enlarge that communion. So that's what we'll be talking about here. Shakespeare, in that poem from The Merchant of Venice, said that mercy is an attribute to God himself. Cardinal Walter Cosper, whose picture is there, and who wrote this wonderful book on mercy, and when the Spanish edition came out during the conclave, when Pope Francis was elected, Cosper gave a Spanish translation to Cardinal Bergoglio, who read it and was very excited by it. So it's a great book. But Cosper says that this idea that mercy is an attribute to God himself, as Shakespeare says, needs to be understood even more fundamentally. He says that it is actually God's defining attribute. It cannot be regarded, he says, as something that's just a marginal or derivative attribute or quality of God. He said, instead, mercy is really the essence of God. The essence of God who is love. Mercy is, as our song said, and I think put it so beautifully. After I heard that song, I said I have nothing more to say. It's, as so often happens with really good music. But mercy is something that's at the very heart of God. As you may know, in English, mercy doesn't say too much, but in the Latin languages, like Latin or Spanish or whatever, it's misericordia. The word cor is the word for heart. Or in German, the word is, it's a mouthful, it's Barmherzigkeit. The word for heart in German is Herz. So when we're talking about mercy, we're talking about the heart. When we talk about God's mercy, we're talking that is something that flows from the very heart of God. As Shakespeare said, the quality of mercy is not strained. It just flows out. It's just part of who God is. And this is why, as Pope Francis says over and over again, God never tires of having mercy. God never tires of forgiving us, because the quality of mercy is not strained. It simply comes out of the very heart of God. And because of mercy coming from God's overflowing heart, what I want to talk about this morning too is that mercy is more than just God forgiving. I think there are other aspects of mercy in this kind of essential attribute of God that we should look at as well. Because I think because of God's mercy, it means that God delights in creating. I talk about the fact that creation is the first act of God's mission. That God can't hold back sharing the communion that God is with other reality. And so creation just flows out. I think that's part of the overflowing heart of God in mercy. And that mercy means that God wants to relieve the inevitable pain and suffering in the world. That's just part of who God is. And because people mess up and do sin and do hurt one another and do hurt creation, God is always there. God never tires of forgiving. So mercy, as I understand it, and I've come to understand it, is a broader concept than just forgiveness. It's the whole way that God works in the world. It's the deepest motive for God's mission. Maybe some of you have heard a colleague of mine speak, Father Anthony Gittins. One time I was on a panel. He's a wonderful British missiologist. And I was on a panel with Tony, and he was talking about God. And he says that God is love hitting the cosmic fan. And I just love that idea. That God is, that's what we mean by God is mission. And that's the mercy is just overflowing. It's just out there. That's who God is. As Tony says, that's God's job description. To be this outflowing love. So let's look then at mercy from the beginning of the universe, from the beginning of creation, and then look in this first part at how mercy is revealed in the people of Israel, or in the history of the people of Israel. A couple of months ago, I read a wonderful biography of Pope Francis by a British journalist by the name of Austin Ivory. I don't know if you've come across that. It's really it's a lovely, very pro Pope Francis biography. It's really wonderful. Toward the end of the book, he talks about as when Pope Francis now is elected. Ivory tells a story about an Angelus message that Pope Francis gave soon after he was elected. In Rome, every Sunday at noon, people gather in St. Peter's Square, and way up in the papal quarters, what used to be the papal quarters, this curtain opens up and the Pope appears from the balcony, says the Angelus with people, and then gives them a little fervorino. Well, in this one, it was maybe about this first or second of these Angelus these Angelus appearances. Pope Francis told the story of an old woman that he had met when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires. And he said in the course of the conversation with this old woman, she said to him, without mercy, the world would not exist. And Francis just, without missing a beat, turned to her and said, "Oh, do you teach theology at the Gregorian University?" So I mean, he just saw the wisdom of that creation is really the act of God's mercy. So it's the first act of God's mercy, and it's, as I said before, the first act of mission. I think it's that expression, of God's love, God's overflowing heart of mercy. Saint Bonaventure, so an early Franciscan, talked about how his understanding of God is love that is diffusive of itself. It's that same idea that Tony Gittins was talking about love hitting the cosmic fan. That's the reality. That's the mercy of God in creation. And the Australian theologian Dennis Edwards talks about the fact that creation is actually the gentle and caring and loving action of the Holy Spirit, who doesn't manipulate, but coaxes and persuades and gives freedom to creation to come together in its own way. So the Spirit is there, coaxing and persuading matter to form the various gases and the various molecules that eventually form the stars and eventually the planets. As life emerges on Earth, is there at the emerging of microbes and things like corals or barramundi or kangaroos and eventually human beings. The American theologian Elizabeth Johnson has this same kind of idea. She writes about how the Spirit's presence is all through the process of creation, but never the presence of a determining monarch. Okay, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is the way it's going to be, that kind of thing. But rather, the freeing and life-giving presence of a lover. That's the way God works. That's the way the Spirit works. Allowing creation under the Spirit's persuasion and love and guidance to freely become itself. That's the work of God. That's the work of the God of mercy. So creation is conceived in and executed in mercy. I arrived here in Australia in about the beginning of February, and 2 days after I arrived, I had to speak at an Anglican mission conference in Melbourne. And so I was there, and the main speaker was an Anglican bishop by the name of Bishop Stephen Picard, who's really an amazing theologian. And one of the things that he said, very similar to what I'm saying here, he says that the universe is sustained by a continual and infinitely patient act of love. This is the God of mercy. The God of mercy that's still at work in creation and still working to persuade and coax and urge the whole of creation to become itself. I in the last several years, my own definition of mission has changed a little bit. I like to think of mission is the participation with God in the completion of the creation of the universe. That God starts out, the first moment of creation is God's first act of mission. And God is through the Spirit particularly present there in the whole of creation. Eventually, this is what we'll talk about in the second part, eventually chooses us to be particular partners in the completion of creation. And so God puts up with us and puts up with the freedom of the creation that God has that God has created. This is why I think it's so beautiful that Shakespeare says that mercy is the mightiest in the mighty. That mercy is the mightiest in the mighty. And in Evangelii Gaudium, Pope Francis quotes Thomas Aquinas saying that mercy manifests God's omnipotence to the greatest degree. So God's omnipotence, God is so powerful that God allows creation to be free. God allows us to be free. Despite all the mistakes and the wrong turns and all that stuff, but that's omnipotence. That's what it means to have mercy. It's the mightiest in the mighty. That God's omnipotence is shown in mercy to the greatest degree. Now, it's in the history, though, of a relatively insignificant people, though, that God reveals God's self fully as a God of mercy. This is in God's choice of Israel. This wonderful little poem by the American poet Ogden Nash. How odd of God to choose the Jews. But it's, in this relatively insignificant community, God chose them to reveal the fullness of God's mercy. It said in Abraham, all nations will find a blessing. And it's in and through Israel then that God would show mercy. When I was writing this talk, sometime in February, soon after I arrived here in Australia, my habit is when I work on a talk, I write it, and footnotes and everything. I write it all out, and then I make a PowerPoint of it. And unfortunately, you have to leave about a quarter of what you've written out, because you can't say everything you want to say. But when I was writing this talk, it was, I think, the third Sunday of Lent, or maybe the second Sunday of Lent. I'm not sure. But the first reading for that Sunday was what Marc Chagall has depicted in the picture up there. It was the story of the call of Moses. And I was really struck by what God says there. God appears to Moses in the burning bush and says, I have seen the suffering of my people. I have heard their cries. And I've come down to do something about it. And of course, and you're going to do it. And so it's that. I think that's again, a sign of God's mercy. God sees, God hears, and with human cooperation, God will do something about it. And I think that's what we see in this call of Moses. So as God gives the law to Moses on Mount Sinai, and in the Hebrew mind, the law is never really a burden. The law is something sweet. The law is actually an expression of God's mercy to Israel. But as God gives the law to Moses on Mount Sinai, there's a passage, I think it's in chapter 33 of Exodus, where Moses says, I want to see your glory. I want to see you as you really are. And God said, well, you can't, but I'll let you see something. And so God puts Moses in the cleft of a rock and passes by Moses. And then when God is almost past, God lets Moses see the divine back, and as God passes by Moses in this moment of great mercy, giving Israel the law, God cries out, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the 1,000th generation. I think this is the great description of the God of Israel. For all God's anger and all that stuff, you go back to this. This is what God is about. Merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. I can't go into all the various passages of the Old Testament about mercy, and that's what I hope that we can do a little bit together after I finish this reflection. But again, in the time that I was thinking about this presentation and preparing it, I ran across a wonderful book by an Anglican theologian by the name of Sam Wells. Sam Wells used to be the chaplain at Duke University in the United States. But he's British. Eventually, he went back to Britain, and he is now the vicar or the parish priest of the famous church St. Martin in the Fields. You've heard about Neville Marriner and the orchestra of St. Martin of the Fields. It's right on Trafalgar Square in the middle of London. He's the parish priest now of that parish, and quite a wonderful theologian and a very good preacher and so forth. Anyway, I was reading one of his sermons, and he's talking about this passage, Hosea 11, the 11th chapter of Hosea. And he says, this chapter really says everything about God and about God's mercy. And he goes on to reflect on this, and he does it in 4 parts. I've just decided to do it in 3 parts here, kind of 3 acts. So he says in the first act or the first part, you see God is reminiscing about God's love for Israel. Israel has turned away, and God says, remember when Israel was a child, I loved him. He said, out of Egypt I called my son. It was I who taught Ephraim how to walk. I was to them like those who lift infants to their cheeks. Sam Wells comments on that. He says, you can feel God stroking Israel's soft skin. What a tender scene that is. But then the scene changes. And, if you have a beautiful major key of music, beautiful, playing, it goes da-dum. It becomes, more of a minor key. And God begins to lament Israel's unfaithfulness. And God says, the more I called them, the more they went from me. My people are bent on turning away from me. So there's this deep lament, after God has remembered in such tenderness, Israel's beginnings. And then there comes the third section, or the third scene, which is where God is not sure what to do. And God is kind of struggling. Which direction should I go? Sam Wells says, it's the most poignant scene, this third scene. And we're here given a window, as it were, into the heart of God. He says, it's like an all-night struggle between sober, realistic pragmatism, let them go, passionate, wild fury, how dare they do that? How dare they turn away from me? And then, in a flood, as always happens with God, a flood of overwhelming, tender mercy. And so the scene ends with, how can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? My heart recoils within me. My compassion, mercy, grows warm and tender. Now, God makes us free. And God can't save Israel from the consequences of Israel's unfaithfulness. They go into exile. In that way they're punished, but it's their own fault. It's what they've brought about on themselves, not being faithful to God and God's law. Pope Francis, though, says that, in quoting Augustine, it's easier for God to hold back anger than mercy. But that doesn't mean that Israel doesn't suffer, but nevertheless, what you see constantly is that God is at work. And eventually, God will bring the people back from exile. And God promises a new covenant and a new heart. And so it's true that it's easier for God to hold back anger than to give mercy. I think there's one small verse, just another broad stroke of reflecting on mercy in the Old Testament. There's one small verse in verse 49. I don't like all of 49. It gets pretty violent at the end. But there's this wonderful verse in the beginning of Psalm 49, which I think is, explains maybe how, again, this is Sam Wells, who says, God's love is crazy, illogical, and a matter of pure grace, pure mercy. And it's this wonderful line, God delights in God's people. God delights in God's people. There's simply something about this people of Israel that catches God's heart, that stirs up God's mercy, no matter what they do. And it's interesting that by the end of the Old Testament, as you get to the end, for instance, of Isaiah, that love, that mercy is destined not just for this little Israel, it's destined for all the nations of the world. I will make my servant, and the servant is Israel, or the servant is an individual. I will make my servant a light to the nations. So this is eventually a universal love, a universal mystery that God is showing through Israel. One of my favorite all-time novels is one that I read for the first time maybe about 5 or 6 years ago. It's by a woman named Marilynne Robinson. She's an American novelist, and the book is called Gilead. And Gilead is a little town in our heartland in the United States, in Iowa, farmland and small towns, something like maybe northern Victoria or western New South Wales, something like that. This little this little town, or Queensland as well. But sorry, but the main character in this novel is a Protestant minister by the name of John Ames. And it's an incredible book. He's writing memoirs to his son. He's writing his own memoirs, and they're to his young son. He had the child when he was very old. It's a long story, but he had the child when he was very old. He's now 75. He has a heart condition, and he knows he's not long for this world, and so he writes these memoirs to his son. And they're just, it's just beautiful. The love of life and the love of God and the pastoral care of it's just an amazing novel. But anyway, in one of his memoirs, John Ames says, now he's Protestant, so he reads John Calvin, the great Reformed theologian of the 16th century. He says, somewhere in Calvin says that each person is an actor on a stage, and God is like the audience, and God's watching all of this. Not so much, we were saying yesterday, not so much like the speed camera in the sky type of idea, but God is watching. What are these people doing? What's this creation? This is really interesting. And Ames goes on to say, I do like Calvin's image. It suggests how God might actually enjoy us. Love that. We think of that far too little, he says. But then he goes on to say, God enjoys us not in any simple sense, but as you enjoy the being of a child, even though he's a thorn in your heart. I just love that, that's, so God is there. God is interested, in what we're doing. God is interested in the evolution of creation. And of course, they're, present and persuading and all that stuff, but nevertheless delighting, in all the variety, that creation has developed. And fascinated by all the crazy situations that human beings get themselves into. And maybe the beautiful music that we make, and maybe the beautiful art that we can produce, and the technology and all that kind of thing. I think that's a wonderful image, really, of God's mercy. That God is there taking delight in God's people. So, wonderful line from Isaiah. Can a mother forget the infant at her breast, walk away from the baby she bore? But even if mothers forget, I'd never forget you, never. This is the God of mercy. This is the God of the Old Testament who delights in God's people. But then we come to the New Testament, and we can speak of incarnate mercy. I don't know if I made that idea up, that idea of incarnate mercy, but it came to me when I was writing this presentation, that Jesus is incarnate mercy. That the incarnate Word, but also incarnate mercy. So in the fullness of time, as Paul writes in the letter to the Galatians, the mercy that had been lavished upon all creation, but at least in the beginning on Israel specifically, takes on a human face in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. So Jesus of Nazareth, as I say, is incarnate mercy. As Pope Francis says in his the document that opens the year of mercy, Jesus is the face of mercy, the vultus misericordiae. Another phrase I like, which somehow captures this too, is a phrase by a British theologian by the name of Mark Oakley. It says, Jesus is God's body language. I just love that. That's what, that the God of mercy, Jesus is God's body language. Jesus shows us the way God is. And we see God's mercy, we see God's mercy in Jesus' healings and exorcisms in his ministry. We see it, for instance, in blind Bartimaeus, the healing of blind Bartimaeus. You remember this in Mark 10. Jesus is passing by the city of Jericho, and there's this blind Bartimaeus there. And what does he do? He says, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus did. Jesus did have mercy on him, and Jesus gave him back his sight. So an act of mercy, showing the mercy of God. Another example is that we see mercy in Jesus' healing of a leper. So in Mark's version, very, very early on in the gospel, the leper says, "Lord, if you will, you can heal me." And Jesus hears that plea for mercy. He was moved to pity, the text says. He was moved to mercy. And the Greek word there is a powerful word. My Greek is not all that good, but I think it's a word, something like spelangthomai, and it means Jesus' very bowels were moved. I mean, it's a very earthy kind of thing. So he was moved to pity. And he reached out and he touches the leper. I was meditating on this a couple of months ago on this particular passage, and I was kind of envisioning Jesus reaching out to this rather untouchable and ugly human being, and I realized, Jesus most likely didn't go, like that, just kind of touch him, but Jesus, it was a touch of mercy. I think that action, is, again, I think it's a sacrament. It's God's body language, about what God is about in the world. So it wasn't a hesitant or a fearful touch. It was a loving and generous and merciful touch, a real embrace. And at Jesus' touch, the leper was healed. Every once in a while, in the Gospels, we see mercy incarnate in just little actions of Jesus. And I saw this again a couple of months ago. I was reading chapter 6 of Mark. Now, in this chapter, Jesus had sent the disciples out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal and all that. And in the beginning of chapter 6, you see them all coming back. And Jesus is in the middle of healing himself, but they're coming back and they're telling him, "Oh, I did this, and this person was healed." And you can just see they're all excited and everything else. And Jesus says, "Okay, why don't we go away for a while? Why don't we go away?" I'm thinking, a good pastoral supervisor, let's process this. Let's think about this. Let's go away. Let's pray. Let's share. And he said, we got to get away. The text says there were so many people there, and they wanted so much that the disciples didn't even have time to eat. So Jesus, let's just slip away. So he and the disciples, go around Lake Gennesareth to the other side where there's, a more deserted place. Well, the people see where he's going. What do? They hire boats. They go across the lake, and when Jesus and the disciples arrive, there they all are, and they're all waiting for Jesus. And if it were me, I would come around the bend and, oh no, oh no, we're trying to get away for a little retreat and everything else, and that ain't gonna happen, So, what does Jesus do? The text simply says, and he began to heal. So it didn't faze him, obviously, at all. And then, of course, the text goes on, where at the end of the day, there's all these people in this deserted place, and they'd gone across the lake, and they had nothing to eat. And so then Jesus, asks them, well, do you have anything? And the little that the disciples have, of course, he multiplies and feeds this huge crowd. But it's just that little gesture to me, it's just, as I say, if I was, oh no, oh jeez, but it's none of that at all. It's just continuing on to be merciful, to be a healer. So really, you see here incarnate mercy. You see the face of mercy. I think you see God's body language very much in evidence here. And many of Jesus' parables, of course, are incarnations in words of God's mercy. And I think the most amazing place where this is true is in chapter 15 of Luke. I read somewhere a long time ago that if by any chance something happened and we lost every copy of the New Testament, wouldn't happen, but if it did, if we lost every copy of the New Testament and we only had chapter 15 of Luke, we would have saved the whole gospel. It's that important for the gospel. So these three parables in the 15th chapter of Luke. The parable of the shepherd who goes in search of the lost sheep. The woman who loses the coin and tears her house apart in order to find it again. Or especially the story of the loving father and the wayward two sons, really, the jerky brother who won't forgive, and the equally jerky brother who wanted his father to be dead so he could get his inheritance. And when he comes back, the father is still waiting. About a year ago or so, I ran across a beautiful poem that I think expresses wonderfully what the reality, particularly of this story of the prodigal son or the loving father, is about. It's I forgot this section. I'll get back to the poem. But anyway, it's just to say, in these parables, what we see is the determination of God. Going out for that lost sheep, going out for or tearing that house apart. We see also the patience of God in the loving Father, waiting for the Son to return. And we see God's joy. God delights in God's people. We see God's joy when that determination succeeds and that patience pays off. So again, we come back to the truth of what Pope Francis never tires of saying, that God never tires of forgiving us. Back to the poem. I ran across this poem. It's by the American poet, a wonderful poet from the Appalachia region of the United States, very poor region, one that is in danger of a lot of ecological devastation. And Wendell Berry is, one of the great champions of this in his work and in his poetry. But this poem is called "To My Mother," and it reads like this: I was your rebellious son. Do you remember? I wonder if you do remember. So complete has your forgiveness been. So complete has your forgiveness been. I wonder sometimes if it did not precede my wrong, and I erred, safe found within your love, prepared ahead of me on the way home or my bed at night, so that almost I should forgive you who perhaps foresaw the worst that I might do, and forgave before I could act, causing me to smile now, looking back, to see how paltry was my worst compared to your forgiveness of it, already given. It's a lovely poem, and I think it says in another fresh way, I think, what we read in Jesus' parable. Of course, God's mercy perhaps was most fully and graphically revealed in Jesus' death on the cross, where literally his heart poured out blood and water for us. As Paul says, I think so powerfully in the letter to the Romans, it's hard enough to die for a good person. But the love of God, the mercy of God is this, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Now, this is the mercy of God. Denise Levertov, another American poet, has written a long poem called "To Live in the Mercy of God." I'm just going to read a couple of lines of it here, but she has several images. I'm just going to read the part where she talks about the image of God's mercy as like a waterfall, that's just pouring out. And she writes this. She says, "To live in the mercy of God, to feel vibrate the enraptured waterfall, flinging itself unabating down and down to clenched fists of rock, swiftness of plunge, hour after year after century. Thus, not mild, not temperate, God's love for the world, vast flood of mercy flung on resistance." I think that captures so well what Jesus' death is all about. That overflowing, that abundance of love, even while we were enemies, even while we were yet sinners. Of course, we know that Jesus' death was not the end. That Jesus went through death, that Jesus conquered death, and his death is not the end of the story. And as the New Testament scholar N.T. Wright says, if Jesus had not risen from the dead, we wouldn't be able to explain how his movement is alive after all these years. So many good people have come into the world. So many people have been killed. Their movements have not continued. But the Jesus movement has continued. It says something about the fact that our founder is alive. Our founder is present. And even more, and this is a segue into my second part, which we'll take in a bit. The mercy of God incarnate in Jesus has been shared with Jesus' disciples. And now we are incarnate mercy in the world. Now we are God's body language in the world, because we share the life of the risen Lord. We share the life of the Trinity as such.